that I serve in his stead. Basically, I'm just going to moderate and let others do the talking. So at this time, we'll call to order the Administrative Committee. We do have a quorum, and we have a lengthy agenda, so let's just get right to it. First item is for discussion and action revision of Bossier Parish School Board Policy DFD, tax and bond elections and sales as recommended by Forethought Consulting. It will be presented by Ms. Nisha Bamberg, Chief Financial Officer. Ms. Bamberg.
Yes, sir. Y'all have a copy of the policy. This is a recommendation from Forethought, and it has to do with Act 205, which amended the revised statute to include a provision that the notice of election should include the estimated cost for the election, and then we should also include in the canvassing of the results a statement of the actual cost of the election. Those were the primary changes. There were a few other changes, just moving things around, but those were the big, I guess, key changes to the policy.
You've heard Ms. Bamberg's presentation. Are there any questions? If not, we'll entertain a motion.
So moved.
Motion by Mr. Slack.
Second.
Second by Mr. Bachhaus. Please vote. Motion passes. Moving to item number 2. Also discussion and action revision of Bossier Parish School Board Policy KF, use of school facilities as recommended by council, and it's being presented by Mr. Doug Rogers with Mormon Moore and Company Incorporated. Welcome, Mr. Rogers. Always good to see you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Bullard, board members, Mr. Downey. Good to be with you tonight. This was an organic conversation that I was brought into. Mr. Geis had called me originally where we were talking about how the pandemic could fundamentally change our traditional risk management approach to some of our outside activities. The one that this really focuses on is outside use of facilities. So I don't know if you had a chance to read it before this meeting, but in board docs will be a letter where I addressed some of the items that I'll be speaking on as briefly as possible, and then we can expound as you have questions. But obviously, with a pandemic, there are some unique considerations. We have to recognize, of course, that the board's primary operation is related to the education of children and all that goes with that. So there's really nothing that we can do after we mitigate as best we can the risk associated with school operations in the middle of a pandemic. Then once you go past that, you look at the second tier activities, and of course the most obvious second tier activity that we have is where we allow outside groups to use school board facilities. As you know, Bossier City, its Civic Center, stayed closed for a short time and then was reopened. CenturyLink, its box office, is open again, but it had been closed. And so our facilities, of course, in addition to those two, are the primary ones available that outside groups like to try to use. Public buildings available. And of course, the board has always tried to be very accommodating to groups, be a good neighbor for many years. One of my primary concerns was that whatever our policies are, that they just very clearly address the superintendent's ability to cancel outside activities on short notice when it's merited. Obviously, even when we contract with people to have activities in our schools, if there are exigent circumstances where we think that puts our kids or our employees at risk, we want to be able to stop that if we need to. Secondly, and I'll let Mr. Self address any questions that you may have, one of the best things we have going for us is the immunity that the Louisiana legislature passed for public entities, including school boards. And we've had conversations about whether or not that immunity applies equally to our primary operations versus secondary, where we rent out our facilities for a fee. And Mr. Self, I don't want to speak too much for you, but in general, I think we believe that the immunity, at least until a court says otherwise, should apply as long as we're acting reasonably either way. Is that a fair statement? And so that's the good thing that we have going for us. Now, what is new, of course, and we've seen it on the news, is no matter where you have a group of individuals gathered, you have two camps of thought. People who believe that precautionary measures are reasonable and people who believe precautionary measures are unreasonable. And it has erupted to everything from fisticuffs to guns being pulled, etc. And that's a new exposure. We really never, to my knowledge, had to worry about things like that. Our biggest concerns were typically, if we had the jamboree, having rival groups together just in supporting their schools and having someone unruly do something. But this is quite different, because even in what should be peaceful civilian assembly, they are having some things that present some new challenges for us, some new security concerns, though our Director of Security is better able to address that than I am, as well as the additional sanitization of the facilities. And so in the past, I know we've always had an excellent custodial staff. They work very hard to make sure our facilities are clean. And of course, we know that's more important than ever now, and that will be needed after these outside groups come in, making sure that the proper procedures are taken to limit the exposure. My biggest concern is if we had a COVID outbreak, and if it was traced back to an outside organization coming in, we just want to make sure that our risk management policy is documented, that we've evaluated the risk, we thoughtfully thought through it, we've mitigated it to the best of our ability. And yes, it happened. We're sorry that, the outbreak occurred from an outside group coming in, but that's possible now, and it's something that we have to think about. The last two items are really interconnected. We've had the $1 million general liability limit required for many years, and as I addressed in my correspondence, I know it goes back to at least '93. I don't know how far before that, but of course it's been, I think, about 12 years when the school board increased its primary limit to $2 million, but we have not changed that minimum threshold for a long time. And it's not that $1 million isn't a lot in coverage, and I'm fortunate to have board members here who do this for a profession, so they're very aware of what I'm going to say. $1 million in coverage isn't what it used to be, and we just have to be aware of that. And of course, we've had practical experience with that. And there are not many entities that will allow others to come in and have lower liability limits than what they carry themselves. And just to be clear, I'm not talking about the excess liability coverage that the board carries. It's usual to not necessarily require every single entity to buy the same excess limit you do, but we're talking about the primary. But I don't want you to think that even if the board decides to update its policy, require more insurance, that our exposure is cured. As I mentioned here, it really occurred after the HIV/AIDS phenomenon, disease, whatever we would like to call it, tragedy, but insurers began introducing at that time various exclusions and limitations for viruses, communicable diseases, and then later, unrelated to that, but they started introducing exclusions for bacteria. And so we could require someone to have $50 million in coverage, but if their policy excludes viruses, it won't matter. In my opinion, I think the board just has to consider that when we allow the outside groups to come in during a pandemic, if that's what the board continues to allow, we just need to know that the insurance that these people are providing may not apply and protect. And so while it would be available to help with other things that we would be concerned about, such as people getting into fights, having something get out of hand and tear up property, something like that, the virus exposure, the big one that we're talking about here, in many of these surplus lines policies, which many special events, general liability insurance policies are, they will most likely exclude that. So, once asked, as always, I'm going to offer you my opinions and information, and that's what I'm here to do tonight. But I'll be glad to entertain any questions. And I know what's on your mind. If we increase the minimum general liability limit to $2 million, what would the additional cost be for people? My expectation, shooting from the hip, is probably a 50% increase in premium. If they're paying $750, 50% of that more. If they're paying $1,000, 50% more. That would be a generalization. Could be less in some circumstances, could be more in some circumstances. But I'll be glad to entertain any questions. Yes, sir.
My question may be for Mr. Self. Am I understanding House Bill 59 correctly when I say as long as we don't show gross negligence, that would then extend to facility usage? I.e., if we know the same policy that we're holding our policies and procedures we're holding ourselves to, that protection would still extend to us in protecting us against those lawsuits?
Well, the first thing I'll tell you is that this is a new law, and with any of these, no matter what you think it says, until something gets to the courts, you really don't know what it says. Now, that being said, my understanding would be that, especially if we are requiring the outside group to follow the certain guidelines, especially the capacity requirements, the social distancing, things like that, then yes, we would have to show gross negligence to be sued.
Rogers is discussing the fights, the other things that are there, that insurance will extend to that. So I guess my biggest concern would be the virus if they're trying to show gross negligence, our exposure as a board to that. So you feel pretty comfortable, and I know it hasn't been challenged by the courts, but you feel pretty comfortable that that would extend?
What I would say, I would feel like that it would extend, especially if the board is doing everything that it's supposed to do, especially if you're following the minimum requirements, the distancing. I think you would probably be best to require masks, but also you would need probably the cleaning staffs to come in, and then if you're following all of that, yes, I believe this would extend. I actually believe it would extend if you're substantially following that. You're getting pretty close, because the way it's written is you have to, if you're a violation of a policy rule adopted for the school system and such action is gross negligence.
Thank you.
Mr. Downey?
Thank you, Mr. Bullard. I just wanted to interject that in order for us to ensure that those guidelines are being followed by entities that use our facilities, is going to require more oversight on our part because of these expectations, along with the enhanced cleaning. So at a time when we could allow usage of a facility and go back and lock it up, now there's going to be an even greater requirement to ensure that those guidelines are in fact being followed while they're using our facilities.
If I could follow up on Mr. Downey's comment, I guess a question, comment, whatever. It sounds like to me, if we allow continued use of our facilities by outside parties, we're going to have increased expense, namely in oversight, because we can't just say, here, you practice these distancing and the appropriate actions to hopefully preclude spreading the virus. We've got to be there to see it, but if we are there and oversee it, then we are assuming liability at that point. Then we have the added cost of cleanup. Certainly, we've got to, it would seem appropriate for us to increase what our charges are. And secondly, is this a liability we want to take on during this time? I know it's hard to turn you back on people we've helped all these years, but the liability based on what's already been said is pretty significant. Mr. Cheatham?
Yeah, and obviously the board can discuss this, but I believe this might be something that we should suspend until we're, through these phases, to keep our liability at a minimum. And I just don't know how our cleaning staff, I just don't know how we can man it and be efficient and cover ourselves. So I would think this would be something that would be better served, suspended use of the facilities until a later date would be my thoughts, but I'll listen to what some of the other board members have to say.
I concur in that. At this point, I don't know, Mr. Downey, what are your thoughts?
Well, Mr. Rogers and Mr. Geis and Roland and Mr. Self and myself talked about this at length. I would ask, before we took that action, allow us to investigate the different uses that are currently in place and determine what those requirements would require of those people to comply, so that we would know exactly how many groups we're talking about. And off the top of my head, I'm thinking 5 or 6. But enhanced cleaning is part of the new, or the additional requirements, if I'm correct. I believe that was the term that was used.
Mr. Downey, from just a pure risk management point of view, yes, sir, I believe that that's got to be what is a major focus if we continue to allow outside groups to use our facilities during a pandemic. Keep in mind, I'm not suggesting that we don't want outside groups in our facilities. We're just talking about during a documented pandemic of allowing them to come in. And so the sanitization that you're talking about is important. The issue that we can probably count on at least some non-compliance no matter what we do. People are going to sit the way they want to sit. They'll wear their mask or not wear their mask if they want to. They'll lick their fingers and run them on the seats if they want to. I mean, you just don't know. Little kids, they're going to be little kids. And so I hope that answers that question.
If I can, I would ask the board to add these additional requirements and then allow us to investigate those individual uses that are currently in place. I feel like that the enhanced policy has a tremendous amount of merit going forward, even out of the pandemic, and then let us separately investigate the current use and determine if that's something we want to address as well.
When you come back, would you also provide us with an estimate of increased cost?
And if I could just add one thing that Mr. Rogers didn't touch on with the updated policy, in addition to the insurance requirements at the very end, we have the refusal of the use of facilities. This updated policy would also move it from the board reserves the right to refuse any request to allow us to cancel any previously approved uses and pay them back the money within 15 days. which in light of the pandemic is something that we should definitely have in the policy. Additionally, the BESI requirements mention the CDC guidelines, which state that the school should limit any non-essential visitors, volunteers, and activities involving external groups and organizations. So that's also something that we would need to look into. We definitely probably don't want to be approving the facilities uses at the same level that we were before the pandemic in that case.
Bird.
That leads me to two questions, but one is if we have a group come in and they disregard the guidelines that we have put in place, would we be covered in a situation like that?
Well, again, it would go back to the gross negligence standard. You know, what steps did the board take? Did they have someone there? Did we have them sign a waiver saying they understood the requirements, you know, give them a list and make sure those were explained to them before that? That would be in our favor to do something along those lines at least to help prevent.
And would it play out of our favor because Bessie's given us a guideline that says limit your exposure by limiting these events, and we approve them? I assume that they could say, well, you right in our guidelines, we've asked you to limit these events, and now you put one on the books and they neglected some of the rules that you had and you didn't uphold them. That put us at some serious risk at that point.
Right. Well, those are the CDC guidelines, and it's not sure whether or not they will say that was just intended to limit visitors and guests onto campus while they're students, or if it would extend further. And again, that's something we're really not going to know until litigation happens.
Are most of our activities athletic? Is that mainly what we're talking about?
Mr. Down.
We have a couple churches that use our facilities and have been for an extended period of time, yeah, along with other athletic events and maybe even some elementary type beauty pageants and things like that. I think it runs the gamut. But I think we're talking about two different groups. The group that we've allowed to do this, that are currently doing it, and then the group, any additional. And I would agree wholeheartedly that any additional or new agreements need to be scrutinized very seriously. And I would ask that you would give us the opportunity to look at the ones that are currently using them and make the determination of whether we need to, what steps we need to take to ensure that they're in full compliance. And if we don't feel comfortable that that can be accomplished, then have a conversation about ending that agreement. But I think those are two different case scenarios.
So was Mr. Cheatham's motion, was that a motion?
No, sir, he was just a comment.
Sounds like a good motion.
Do we have any other questions or comments?
One last thing, Mr. Bullard, if I may, is a lot of times we talk about the dollar and cents. I want you to realize that we're taking into consideration community relations, the heart of this board, and part of risk management is reputational risk management. We keep that in mind as well. And ultimately, we know that what's more important to this board than liability is we don't want to get our kids and our people, our teachers and our staff sick. And so it's not that our risk management review is intended to be adversarial to any outside group. It's just we're trying to act in a way that helps keep the people we're charged with safe. And so I just wanted to be clear about that. It's not just a dollars and cents consideration that initiated this. It's trying to keep people as safe and whole as we possibly can.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. This agenda item was both for discussion and possible action. I gather that the superintendent is requesting we defer action and allow him to Oh, certainly, yes, sir.
I apologize if I was confusing. My request would be that we accept this amended policy, or make the move to amend the policy based on the information we've discussed, and then also allow us to examine current usage to determine if there are any potential risk there for us as a board. So I would appreciate if the board would pass this new policy.
So the request is that we do act on the policy revision and allow then the administration to consider implementation down the road. So we'll entertain a motion to approve revised policy KF. Motion by Ms. Brotherton, second by Mr. Bachhaus. Please vote. Okay, it is unanimous. Moving on to item number 3, and revision of several policies as recommended by Forethought, and they are all presented by Mr. Rowland, our Assistant Superintendent of Administration. Mr. Rowland, we got tied up there, so we have a limited amount of time. I'm going to ask you to please move quickly through these multiple revisions.
Yes, sir. Be glad to. Thank you, Mr. Bullard, President Bamberg, Superintendent Downey. Much of our charge over the past year has been look at our policy manual and see where we can make sure we clean it up, we can concise things, clear things up, and that's really what we're coming to you with today. A number of these are brought to us by Forethought, and these are suggestions for us to implement into our policy. Other ones we're coming to you on behalf of staff and things that have come up. I sent you the list on Friday. I hope we've had a chance to at least look at the summary that we provided to you. Mr. Bullard, with your permission, I'm assuming we're going to take these first 9. These are all revisions. We'll take these first 9 as one. Is that correct?
This meets the approval of the committee.
And moving quickly, the first one is expense reimbursement. And just to give you the purpose there, we have used these procedures for many years in the reimbursement of our employees for their expenses. However, the board had never approved this. It was a procedure, it wasn't a policy. We're asking the board to approve that to make this now a formal policy. The only caveat to this is, Ms. Bamberg and I have been working on this, is that we have, one of the things that we wanted to address was meal reimbursement to the employee based on overnight stay. Any questions about expense reimbursement? The second one is equal employment opportunity. This comes to us through Forethought, and this is the charge. The school board does not discriminate in the basis of race, color, national origin, sex, age, disability, marital status, sexual orientation, religious or veteran status, in admission to access, et cetera, et cetera. This is one of the policies that's been pulled out of Title IX. This supports Title IX, but there's the new policy that I'm going to share with you at the very end. This is now a standalone policy, and we've taken, Forethought took the liberty to create some deletions, some strike-throughs, but also reworded the first part that I just read to you, equal opportunity, equal employment opportunity. Any questions on that part? Okay. The next one, the next revision is non-Title IX, grievance and procedures for employers, students, and parents and guardians. Again, this supports the new Title IX policy. The change, of course, is the title, non-Title IX, but it's our standard grievance procedure that we go through, detailing all 5 levels of the grievance policy. Any questions with regard to that one? The next one is Title VII, Sexual and Gender Harassment. And this policy was one that was just defined a little bit better. It's a supporting policy that separates itself from Title IX. So you have two distinct policies now. That gives us some specific examples of behavior that are not specified in the previous policy. Additions are also the failure to forward any sexual harassment report or complaint as provided could result in disciplinary action. That's the main change in the Title VII, Sexual and Gender Harassment. Any questions with regard to that? Seeing none, the next one is again, brought to us by Forethought, and this is the new policy it's not a new policy, it's a renamed policy that's now titled Investigations. It used to be charged as reporting. The policy states that the method and the manner in which investigations, used to be called reporting, would be done or is to be done. This was formerly the reporting procedures, now investigation procedures. One addition to this policy is that the board will attempt to protect the privacy of the complainant, but it's not a given. It's not mandatory. Any questions about investigations? The next policy comes to you on behalf of staff, which is compensation. And simply in the third paragraph under work week, we are asking the board to allow the district to us to change the work week from 12:01 a.m. Thursday morning to Monday at 12:01 a.m. That's the simple change with compensation. Any questions about that? The next revision is that of staff schedules. We were advised to remove two pieces of our work schedule, staff schedule language here. And what we found, we had another section in another policy called work schedule that contradicted that. So based on guidance from Mr. Geis and his staff, we have reworded that to make this consistent across both policies. We have deleted the 15 minutes before and 15 minutes after requirement, as well as we've deleted the 7.5 hour workday for exempt employees. Teachers are exempt from overtime, so that really had no bearing on their workday. Any questions about staff schedules? The next revision is sexually related student misconduct. This comes to us from Forethought. And to be honest with you, this is an intervention. This is an intervention policy that's been placed before you go to sexual harassment. Thus the name change to sexual misconduct. It's an avenue where an act may not necessarily be claimed or can be categorized as sexual harassment, but it gives you an opportunity to deal and have a policy to manage through a case that now will be called sexual misconduct. This largely relates to students. Any questions about that? Again, comes from Forethought. And the last revision is our public conduct on school property. This particular policy supports the one that Mr. Rogers brought to us about facility usage, and this is very important to us in that it amends to now include student employees and those that are using our facility are going to be held to such conduct. Also, we wanted to make sure to point out to the board that we have included that all said members will also obey the instructions of law enforcement, security officers, and school resource. That was not in our policy before. Any questions about public conduct?
Comment for the record, we were all provided with these revisions several days ago. We have had an opportunity to review them in depth and contact you if we had any questions previously. So it's not like you're just punching through them. We've all had the opportunity to review and comment previously.
That concludes the revisions portion of that agenda item.
I'll make a motion that we accept these revisions.
Have a motion to approve these revisions. Do I hear a second? Second by Mr. Dean. All in favor, please vote. Mr. Slack, are you voting?
Me?
Yes, sir.
I thought I voted.
You're going to have to raise your hand.
Oh, I'm sorry.
There you go. It's unanimous. And moving on to item number 4, discussion for and action, adoption of new Bossier Parish School Board policies as recommended by Forethought Consulting and our council, as presented by Mr. Jason Rowland, Assistant Superintendent of Administration.
two new policies that we have for you tonight, and I sent them to you. The first one, of course, is the Title IX sexual harassment. This is a new policy provided to us by Forethought. I sent you a detailed explanation of that, and that's really what I have today. Does anybody have any questions about what was sent? That's the nuts and bolts of the new policy. It is lengthy, it is exhaustive, it's about 7 pages long, but that is the one that Forethought and that we are hoping to adopt for Bossier Parish School Board. Any questions about that one? Title IX. And the last one, of course, is the COVID-19 public health emergency. The last time we came to you on July the 16th, we were presenting that night our reopening plan, and that afternoon about 2:30, we were blessed with some new directions, and Coach Downey and I went through our handbook as fast as we could. The policy that it's in front of you tonight, we were not able to send it to you because it was embargoed. You could not transmit this policy, so we had to provide it to you in person, in paper. And essentially, this is the Strong Start Handbook. These are all the guidelines. Again, we went through and we checked off and checked crossed all the T's and dotted all the I's in accordance to our Strong Start policy. So any verbiage that we did not have in ours is covered in the policy, and that protects the board and Bossier Parish Schools in our effort to start back during phase 2 of this pandemic. Any questions about that?
Mr. Bullard, if I may, the reference or the comment about the document or attachment being embargoed, that is a procedure or safety procedure that we put in place after the malware scare last fall. And from time to time, there are documents that are sent by different entities that we work with that, for whatever reason, I'm sure Mr. Thompson could go into great detail if you're interested. They are embargoed for 3 to 4 days to make sure that there's no bug. Is that the correct term? So this document, we contacted Mr. Guy several times to try to get our hands on it, and I think that I just wanted to explain so nobody thinks that we weren't trying to communicate this information. This is actually a security procedure that stopped that document from being transmitted.
Members of the committee, you've heard Mr. Rowland's presentation on these two policies, JAAA and EBBI. We'll entertain a motion to approve them as presented. Mr. Dean makes a motion. Do I hear a second? Second by Ms. Brotherton. Any other questions or discussion? If not, please vote. It's unanimous approval. Thank you, Mr. Rowland. You moved us through quickly, quicker than we had anticipated. Does any member of the committee have anything further they wish to discuss or bring before the committee this evening?